Okay, everybody, we're going to start this now. This is the very first of what I hope will be many webinars. I have slides in our Waimea Arboretum Foundation library from about a dozen trips that I took, mostly in the 70s and 80s. The first giant trip was as an exchange student in South India. But this trip was my second very big trip, and it was most of 1974 in South America. And I think everyone knows that Waimea Valley, or Hi'ipaca, the other name, Hi'ipaca LLC, we're a nonprofit, and we're all following a mission to care for the natural resources of Waimea Valley. But some of our collections have come from South America. And this is the second major trip I took to South America. I went for the first time. No, this was the first trip I took to South America. I went for the second time in 1990 on a collecting expedition for Waimea. But this trip was 16 years earlier, when I had never even heard of Waimea. Hadn't been to Hawaii then. I came in 1976. So about a year and a half after I got back from this trip was my first night in Hawaii. Oh, so the etiquette is, if you want to say anything, just raise your hand. I think Anissa will be able to see your faces, and keep your mic muted until we tell you to unmute it. And then just be respectful of other attendees. I don't think anyone's going to do anything mean. just be aware that you're one of hopefully many once we get going. So I'm going to turn this over to Anissa just to push a button, and we'll start with what we've already previously recorded. And I'm going to interrupt a few times when I see we've gone past some areas that I don't have full enough explanation for. Yep. 1974, this was the Nixon era. And in spite of that, it was one of the most optimistic times to be alive. There was still no thought of global warming. AIDS hadn't happened yet. The world was everybody's oyster. It's just unlimited optimism. And that's the attitude with which I started off on this amazing adventure in South America. And the first slide that's showing up here is maybe the highlight of my trip. And this was on the Rio Napo, one of the tributaries to the Amazon. And I traveled the whole length of it, starting at the highest navigable place, where missionaries had been killed 2 years earlier by Guarani Indians and had been eaten too. So with that in mind, I said, what the hell? And started with this guy named Derek down the Rio Napo, hitchhiking in dugout canoes. And the first 2 or 3 rides were fantastic. We ended up in little villages where we were welcomed and celebrated, and people had never seen outsiders like us before, and we entertained them with playing flute, showing magic tricks, and it was just a really delightful time. But anyway, on this river trip, our main ride was this boat that's painted blue. It has a thatched roof, and our mission was to pick up pigs from Indian settlements. As we went, it took, I think, about 2 weeks for us to get all the way down the Rio Napo, but this was after, a week or two before we found this cool boat ride. And this long-term boat ride instead of just little dugouts. This guy had a family, and they were trading pots and pans and blankets and cigarettes for pig meat. And we bought the pig meat in the form of live pigs that had to be weighed individually and then put under the gunnels of this boat. So by the time we got down to Iquitos, there were about 40 pigs all fighting with each other, just snarling, and we were basically just perched on all these loose boards that kept us. I mean, God knows what would have happened if we'd fallen down into that swarm of angry animals. But luckily it never happened. And there were some babies with us too. I mean, he had his young wife and kids, and we saw plenty of Indian families as we went down the river. One funny thing about the boat is that it had a hatch of chickens in the back, and the 10 horsepower outboard constantly had blue smoke just kind of filtering through this poor chicken coop attached to the back of the boat. But we had, good weather, and many places we stopped. Here's some guinea fowl, some wild Amazonian birds that were used to populate Waimea Valley. You don't see those anymore, but they used to be common critters here. Here's some of the poor Indian kids that we saw from inside the boat looking out. And this is one of the few other fairly big boats that we saw going down the Rio Napo. And this was 1974, but 16 years later, I went down to the same river on a plant collecting trip for Waimea Valley. And 16 years later, this river had been clear cut. What used to be this really narrow corridor of forest that went right up to the river's edge was absolutely clear cut to the horizon. The only thing standing would be a few ceiba pentandra trees, which were of useless, timber. And very sad, just because the Ecuadorian government had this perverse policy of asking people to clear land before they could claim it. And anyway, this trip led us past the Peruvian border, where somebody failed to stamp one of our passports, and we had to take a Peruvian naval boat 2 hours back to get that necessary signature, and then we rejoined our cool boat ride picking up pigs all the way down to Iquitos. And from there, we took 2 different rivers upstream in fairly big, high-powered boats, finally getting to this little town of Cajamarca. And this is the place where the Incan Emperor Atahualpa was killed by the Spanish conquistador Pizarro. And I got to the coast from here, and this is really sad that I don't have pictures to show, but I got to Lima eventually, going down the coast, and most people first stop at Lima on their way to Machu Picchu, which is certainly the most dazzling bit of architecture you can see in South America. But most people would take the coastal route, going south from Lima, and then taking an interior route directly to Cusco. But I had heard about this amazing train ride going from Cusco to Huancayo. And this train goes above 3 miles above sea level on the way there. It is just some of the most brilliant engineering that's ever occurred anywhere in this world. I have a quote of something like 66 tunnels and 30-some bridges that were all built by hand and were still functioning, actually, in 1974. Who knows now? But this train ride was so thrilling. And at one point, porters would come around selling blasts of oxygen from bladders. And I breath of that oxygen really made a difference. Anyway, after arriving at Huancayo, I took the trucks to the town of Ayacucho. And the road there was interrupted by a fallen bridge. And trucks and buses would arrive at both sides of this fallen bridge, and the passengers and goods were just exchanged, and then the trucks and buses would just turn around and go back in the opposite directions. But these were very narrow roads, and there were times with which there could only be eastbound traffic, and times which there could only be westbound traffic, and often the communication was incomplete. And there were times when we actually had to squeeze by other vehicles that were going the wrong way at the wrong time. And we're talking about, inches from a sheer drop-off. But these were fun, friendly trips with people just generally, everyone chewing coca leaves. It's just like the universal activity in highland South America that was just really fun to indulge in and just made you instant friends with everybody you shared your leaves with. So it was it made conversation easy and broke the ice with a lot of people. from Cusco, it was just this fascinating city of narrow streets, and apparently most of the architecture is built on the ruins of Incan structures. And the main plaza has two giant churches and then an arched set of buildings on the other sides of the street. And usually bands performing in the town square. But there are pictures here of just sort of an overview of Cusco and the narrow streets. And there's a picture here of Sacsayhuamán, which is this fortress on the outside of Cusco. And these stones are massive and fit together so perfectly that there's no cement, but you could still slide a postcard between the rocks. And to this day, nobody knows how in the world they were able to smooth and cut stones so perfectly. It just defies science. So Sacsayhuamán is as amazing a structure, and probably even more work went into that than Machu Picchu, which was really just a retreat for the Virgins of the Sun. It was their protection, living high atop hills, and nothing could be seen from the river that curls around this. Anyway, more pictures of Sacsayhuamán. So finally arrived in Machu Picchu, and we took the early morning train that left Cusco before first light and got to the base of Machu Picchu just as the sun was rising. Though, of course, you couldn't see it from deep in the valley where you were. And we were able to get a collectivo that took us up switchback roads up to the high plateau of Machu Picchu. And it is just one of the most glorious structures you've ever seen. It's not a single structure. It's a whole very fortified mountain village. And it was self-contained, all these terraced farms and agricultural slopes, all made into stepping stones of little rich farm beds. And Machu Picchu, behind it is this taller conical mountain, Huayna Picchu. And I stayed up in Machu Picchu for longer than a day. Actually, it was illegal to stay there overnight, but I met some Canadians and we kind of eluded the authorities, and we made our way up to Huayna Picchu and slept at the top there. Wandering around Machu Picchu, you can see so much statuary, and I guess there was a lot of human sacrifice there too, because some of the stonework had these grooves cut into it, which were apparently to allow blood to flow. This was an altar which was used for human sacrifice there. And so many nooks and crannies all through Machu Picchu. The rock work is unreal. There's one picture here of two Canadian girls on the other side of this wooden plank. And it was a drop-off of hundreds of feet below that. And you had to get across. And I saw a slide of exactly the same bridge that was taken about 20 years later from some other travelers that have been to Machu Picchu. I just can't believe this was exactly the same. You can see how they took advantage of the natural stone to carve and put in like a 3D puzzle, wedges, other stones. And this is taken from the top of Huayna Picchu, looking back down at the saddle of Machu Picchu. And this was a place where the descent, which probably along old Incan trails would go all the way down to the Urubomba River, but we stayed pretty much high up at the Machu Picchu and went back through the ruins. And eventually spent the night the next night at the bottom of the switchback road leading up to Machu Picchu, and that's where 3 or 4 of the people that I was with went swimming in a natural hot water. It was a concrete, pool that might have served people years ago, but it hadn't been used, and I was the only one that didn't put my head completely underwater. The others that did had their eyes swollen shut the next morning. And so we took the train back, and I led these temporarily blinded people back to Cusco, and they recovered. But that was part of the adventure. So more pictures just looking straight down from the top of Huayna Picchu to the windy Urubomba River below it. And then there's a lot missing now between that slide of Machu Picchu and then getting down to the southern part of Lake Titicaca, to this Bolivian town of La Paz. Of Coroico. La Paz is actually the capital of Bolivia, and we were there for a while. And then we went back north to the edge of Titicaca, and that's where we spent about a month in this little town of Coroico. And it was just this magical place. And every day there was one bakery that would, at 3 p.m, come out with plates of empanadas. And that's just what we lived on. And I would get sliced tomatoes and just open these cheese-filled, freshly baked cakes. And that's all you needed. But we were in Coroico for one of the most amazing celebrations that I've ever seen, and we were invited into it. There were no other Westerners there, but this picture of these dancing people in these hoop-like costumes, they're dancing on a bed of flower petals, which has been laid out that covers the street. And that night, it devolved into this really drunken celebration where these poor villagers were handing out, even to us rich gringos, little shot glasses of aguardiente and tequila, and just everyone was just roaring drunk. And next morning, the part of the custom was that everyone throws water at everyone else, as if to wash away all the sins of that previous night. Because this is a religious event, definitely sanctioned by Catholicism, and I'm sure there was a Mary or two that was carried through the streets following this procession. So look at these people that are dancing in these costumes made of hoops, mostly metal. That was a pretty cool thing. That alone would have been enough. But from the edge of Lake Titicaca, we took a boat, and here we are lining up. It is a fishing boat that we took out to an island called Isla del Sol. And this is, according to some legends, the birthplace of the Incan culture. And there was nobody else with us. And as we were riding out to the island, I think that's looking back at the mainland, there were actually water spouts that came up. And that's apparently a very frequent occurrence at a lake which is as high as this one. I guess the atmosphere just does weird things up there, and you get these tornadoes that seem to be coming up from the water spouts, and we could see them like 100 yards away. And if they'd hit the boat, I don't know what would have happened. Maybe capsized. It was not warm either. I mean, if you fell into that water, you probably would have been hypothermia pretty easily. But one edge, this is now a picture from the Isla del Sol, and you can see the snow-capped Andes in the background and the windswept waters of Lake Titicaca. And we were welcomed as strangers by the friendly residents and allowed to put our backpacks. We slept in the town schoolhouse there. But as the sun was setting, we heard flute noises, and we came out and saw one of the most amazing celebrations. These people were dancing in costumes that actually had leopard skin in them that had probably been passed down for generations. They were playing flute, and they were doing some pre-Christian celebration that was just absolutely fascinating to watch. And again, it just sort of devolved into this drunken party that we all enjoyed each other's company and laughed our heads off over really stupid things. And eventually we slept and left back to the mainland the next day. And here's another big gap in the slides, but going from Titicaca, went to the town of Cochabamba. which is in central Bolivia, and that's where they have what I think South Americans consider the best of the Mardi Gras. You know, leave Rio to the tourists, but we weren't there for the Mardi Gras time, but that was one of the reasons Cochabamba was famous. And it was a beautiful old town, probably really rich at one point, probably because of the silver that was mined in this nearby town of Potosi, this mountain that's about 2 miles above sea level, and it's almost solid silver. And that is what sort of financed the Spanish galleons. Spain basically became a world power because of that one discovery in Bolivia. In their colony, they exported so much silver from there to China, too. But Iguazu Falls is the place where where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay all meet. And it had been raining for quite a few days before I got there. And stayed at the house of an ex-Nazi who had a young wife who was only 24 and working on her 8th baby. And it was a fantastic little spot that we stayed. And there were a few other travelers there, but not too many people because of all the rains recently. But those rains contributed to the falls being just spectacular. And just look at some of these slides of this water. They have something equivalent to the Niagara Horseshoe Falls, but these are much, much taller and certainly more volume, greater volume of water. This is the Paraná River that is breaking right here between Brazil and Argentina. And from this amazing place, there's the sort of Horseshoe Falls part of the place. There are little metal walkways that would go right over the lip of the falling water that had been built, decades earlier. And apparently this was quite a visiting site for rich Europeans back in the 20s and 30s. And one of those walkways fell with people on top of it about 4 or 5 years after I visited this place. That must have been pretty horrible. Yeah. From Cochabamba, I went east to Sao Paulo in Brazil. And Sao Paulo was under a giant meningitis epidemic. So I just stayed on the transportation and went right to Rio. And almost got a job teaching English in Rio. I would have been paid $7 an hour, which was quite a bit of money back then. And it just didn't pan out, though. It turned out they needed a 2-week training course before I could start teaching at that rate. But I stayed with very interesting people in Brazil. One was a professional guitarist, and actually from Rio, that's when I got to Iguazu Falls after going south from Rio on the way to Argentina, on the way to Buenos Aires. Then I came back north, and this time I hit the west coast in Peru, and then I got to this beautiful part, because this is the second time I came back to Lima. And here are these boats made of totara reeds, which I believe grow in Lake Titicaca, but here they're used as ocean vessels. Yeah, so there's somebody riding one of those boats out off the coast of Peru. And there's some more of the boats that are, I guess they have to dry out between times that you ride them. Just some ancient structure on the coast of Peru. And another fascinating thing on the coast of Peru is this village that is actually pre-Incan, and it's called Chanchan. And it was built in one of the driest places in the earth. And who knows if it isn't all washed away now with the weather changes. But at that point, when I visited this in 1974, the last time they had a major rainfall was in 1927. And that did wash away about half of this. So I imagine this is not even to be seen anymore. But this was one of the places that was also plundered by Pizarro because of all the gold that was buried underneath it. Yeah, I just wish I had more slides of the cooler things I did. And one thing I'm remembering right now, and I read these letters I wrote to my parents about it, but when we were in this town of Coroico, I met an old guy who told me about this fantastic gold discovery that had just been made way up the Tipuani River. Now, we have a tree here called Tipuani Tipu, which is named for that part of Bolivia, but it took like 3 or 4 truck rides and a missionary school bus, and finally to get to this one little town. And I was traveling with a guy named Tom Olson, who had been also in Coroico with me, and he and I panned for gold for 3 or 4 days while we were there, and we found about 7 grams altogether, which was a hell of a lot by today's standards. Back then, we just squished it stuff flat. It was already alluvial chispitas, they called them, and we used big wooden panning, big wooden pans to pan for gold. And we were taught to look for layers of yellow sediment in the river, and if you go about 2 feet under that, then you might find a little vein of gold. And this is just the most minuscule amount that will turn up at the very center of your pan, and it's a real elaborate trick of dripping water over it so everything washes away except for the gold. That was fun to mail back to friends. We put it on the envelope and put a stamp on top of it, and that was a fun way of getting out of there. But boy, I was so conscious of the fact that while I was in Tipuani, that could have changed my whole life. I could have stayed there and maybe become extremely rich with gold mining, but you would have been exploiting some other country and it would have been American know-how or a higher technology that basically was robbing the locals of what they deserved. And it was just an interesting thing to observe, and realizing, okay, here's a possible fork I could take in the road of life that could lead to incredible tragedy or success. And I just thought I'd stay on the road, and I'm glad I did. Ended up in a pretty good place here.
What would you say is your favorite highlight from the trip?
I think that trip down the Rio Napo, I realized how thrilling that was and how few people had ever done that before. And, one of the things I really love about travel is anachronism. When you get to a place where, God, you could be in the 1930s and not a thing has changed. And it's also the consciousness and surrounding yourself with people that whose minds haven't been polluted with the modern world of audiovisual entertainment. I think there's something about the purity of what I call primary people, but most people call primitive people, that keeps the world going. The prayers that they send, I think are what keeps the world revolving. And more power to these still unpolluted parts of the world culturally. And I wish there were more of them, and I know that by visiting them, I'm probably diluting them of their purity.
You did your final on Ayurvedic medicine.
Yeah.
What was your experience in South America in relation to your final? So were you able to learn more about it, or no, not really?
I didn't do any sort of medical.
You're just like, we're just here for the trip.
Yeah. Yeah, I did have a medical condition of hepatitis where I actually jaundiced. And like I say, this was just probably one of the most optimistic times in the world. And what a great time to experience the culture of a lot of other backpackers that were not so much American as they were European and Australian, and just a lot of forward thinkers that I got to associate with. And we all kind of realized that we were very privileged to be sort of slumming it in the third world, but also most of us were receptive to all the good things you can learn by being surrounded by the real world as opposed to what we go back to. And, India, I had my 21st birthday there, and that's when I think my worldview crystallized in India. I've always come back to, every time I've come back to America, it's been culture shock. I just can't believe the richness of this country and the surplus and excess, and how unhappy people are with what so many others would be overjoyed with. Well, it looks like we have all of, am I being heard right now?
Yeah, you're being heard.
Yeah, it looks like we have all of 5 people watching this. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer any. And yeah, you know how to unmute your mic to ask. Oh, hello, Jill.
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever go have a chance to go back to Machu Picchu?
No,
Or was
never
that
did.
your one time?
My middle brother did and took his whole family, and I think he had a very different experience than I did. There was one hotel way up there, even back in 74, and the only thing on the menu I could afford was a bowl of tomato soup. And boy, was that great.
How long were you away altogether?
It was from March till November of 74. So count them up, 7 or 8, 9 months.
Did you bring back anything for Waimea Valley, any plant material?
No, this was really before I got into plants.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this was, I came to Hawaii for the first time 2 years after this trip. And I really didn't get into plants until about having been here for 10 or 15 years. I was teaching school in Manoa, and that was in the mid 80s. And then when I went, but at that same time, I was starting to volunteer at Line Arboretum. And so when I left in 87 to Indonesia, that was definitely a very plant oriented trip, because I had letters of introduction from my friends at Line Arboretum that allowed me to go to Bogor, the really wonderful botanical garden on the western part of Java. And these letters of introduction allowed me to get seeds that I mailed back. And it was pretty amazing to have letters that let me get a red carpet treatment in Singapore and in a little botanical garden in Penang, an island off of the Malaysian peninsula.
I have to say that this is really exciting to be able to create this experience today, all sitting in our homes, except for, of course, you're in Waimea, David. But yeah, I'm really happy that it's working out. And Anissa, thank you so much for all of you did to help make this possible. And
yeah, this is Anissa's expertise is what's making this possible completely. I couldn't do half of this, fraction of this.
Yeah. Plus that, I think a lot more people might be interested in this in the future, but we need to really figure out how to market it better. That's really the key.
Yeah. And I've told a few people that I guess they didn't have a chance to tune in, but I feel at ease telling about this, and we can polish this up, and eventually we're going to have something that can go on YouTube. And so this is just a rough draft, and I really wanted to talk a lot more about Colombia, because before I got to the Ecuadorian border, basically it was just taking a train ride down through the Central Cordillera. But wow, what a place. And I really want to go back to Colombia with the Heliconia Society either next year or the year afterwards. That will be their next big trip, and we should really get off the road. So that's in the horizon.
So you did this taping at the library, is that correct?
That's right. And then I'm actually talking from Richard's office right now.
Yeah. And so is it possible for you to talk like you are doing right now in the library, or is the connection not there for that to happen?
There's no connection in the library, apparently. So
okay.
This is probably where we'll do it from now on.
Okay, yeah.
But, we have slides coming up of, other places where people really haven't been that much, or back when I was there, like I was in in Burma, in Myanmar for 1 week in 1987. And that country was closed before and after I went there. And the China pictures, because I was in China, 8 years before the Tiananmen massacre. And I got to places way into the hinterlands that I have some good slides of. So we do have some cool things coming up, I hope. Yeah, thanks for coming. And we'll conclude this now. And any other questions, first of all? Yes, Jill?
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me. It was absolutely fascinating, really
glad.
enjoyable. Thank you, David.
Very welcome. My pleasure.
So nice to see you, Jill. My video, if I undo it here, I've got so much, I have so much light coming. It's really kind of hard on the eyes and I don't know how to shield it out.
Oh, it's fine.
But
I can see you just perfectly.
yeah. And Michan and Akiko and Anissa and Janet, I haven't seen for a long time. She's in Kailua, right?
Good.
Oh, look, hi.
Thank you guys for the feedback. Definitely we're going to polish this up. Jill, your comments about the audio, they were really great. So I'll be working on that. We'll get all the maps up. We'll get all those different things. There's a lot of cool things we're going to add. So yeah. Woo.
Yeah, it's really good. I look forward to the next one.
Good. Yep, probably 2 weeks from now.
Oh yeah, all right. So
Bye, everyone.